my artwork went from looking like this to this. And my days went from looking like this to this. This change was exciting and disorienting and humbling, and ultimately has led to my cultivating an art practice that moves between art studio and lab, and that incorporates methods of physics, chemistry, and biology into my work. So tonight, I thought I'd tell you how that whole journey came about, what's come of it, and a little bit about where it's going. To tell this story, I have to introduce my college-age self. That's me on the left. Rainbow wings were big in the 90s. As an art student, I became enthralled with this painting. It's called the Annunciation, and Jan van Eyck painted it in the 1430s. What I found, and still find fascinating about this painting, is the way that Jan van Eyck worked with light here. And not so much the way that he represents light with the rays coming through the window and the psychedelic angel wings. But I mean the luminosity of the fabric and the glass and the faces that add to the sumptuousness of this painting. Back then, I was dumbfounded as to how he did this, and I became consumed with the desire to want to learn. This led me to leave college for a year, to move from Ohio to San Francisco, to study 15th century painting and paint-making techniques as a painter's apprentice. This experience helped me understand in a hands-on way how in the 15th century, Jan van Eyck completely transformed the relationship between paint and light. And it made it so that he was able to incorporate light into the body of his paintings. Let me show you how this painting is built. Van Eyck basically took the optical principles that he learned as a stained glass window maker's apprentice, and he brought them into painting. Instead of using thick applications of pigment-dense paint, he applied these thin layers that were more oil and resin than they were pigment. And this made his paintings function like layered glass. So because of this, light reflects, refracts, and transmits at the surfaces between each layer, making his paintings incredibly sophisticated optical devices. So for some 8 years after my apprenticeship, I worked obsessively to cultivate my skills as a painter. Every morning I would mix my paints from pigments, and every couple months I had this setup in the backyard where I would concoct my oil mediums. It looked like this witch's brew situation where I would cook my oil for 6 hours using these 15th century chemical protocols. As I painted, I would think about my paintings as optical devices, and I would think about how the light was moving through the paint, how it would reflect from the white panel at the back and then bounce back towards my eyes. So given that I was spending my day thinking about light and bodies and optical devices, it makes a certain sense that I became fascinated by structurally colored animals. So you guys have all seen beetles and butterflies and fish that look kind of metallic, like change color as they move. Well, I became fascinated by these animals, and even more so when I realized I couldn't paint them with pigment-based paints. So learning why I couldn't paint them really changed my whole understanding of light and color. Let's dwell on this for a moment, because it's really important to what I'm talking about. Take a look around this room, at the walls, at the floor, at your clothes. All the color you're seeing is pigment-based color, pretty much. And although pigments come from a variety of sources, the relationship with light is simple. They absorb certain wavelengths of light and they reflect others. And the reflected light is what we call the object's color. The colors of metallic-looking animals like the mother butterfly aren't caused by pigmentation at all, but by tiny geometries smaller than wavelengths of visible light. this kind of color is called structural color. It's color that results from how a material is made rather than what a material is made of. So for a while, I didn't think it was possible for me to use this sort of color as a painter. But as I was painting and listening to a lot of NPR, I started hearing stories about nanotechnology, and I started thinking, well, these are the guys who could make this sort of structural color. After a couple months, I wrote a letter to Paul Alivisatos, who's a chemist at UC Berkeley, who I didn't realize at the time was such a big, looming figure in the world of nanoscience. So I told him that I had this idea to mimic metallic-looking, structurally colored animals using nanoparticles. Much to my surprise, he wrote me back. And after we met, he invited me to become a member of his lab as their artist in residence. The surprises kept coming. First of all, I was stunned by how welcoming my new lab mates were and how excited they were to have an artist in their lab. And I was completely dependent upon their generosity because I was in way over my head. I had only taken high school level science, and here I was calculating molarities and trying to envision, quantum physical events and not kill myself or others in a chemistry lab, So these good souls became my tutors in the dark art of nanoparticle synthesis. I was encouraged that the learning process was really similar to being a painter's apprentice. I would follow them around and scribble in my notebook and try to repeat what they did and mess it up almost every time. But by and by, I picked it up. And my mentors didn't just teach me about, how to make nanoparticles. They also initiated me into their culture. And by that I mean, I came to appreciate what an intensely creative practice science is. And I was also struck by how deftly they navigated uncertainty. And when nanoparticles are around, there's plenty of uncertainty. Trying to get nanoparticles to behave in ways you want them to is like trying to catch a greased pig. And that's if you know what you're doing. After several months, I became decently proficient at making nanoparticles in liquid solution, but I was still really far away off from having any sort of usable material I could make art with. Part of my problem was scale. This is what my scientists would think of as a huge nanoparticle synthesis. But when I condensed this whole batch down to get a vibrant color, I was left with about a milliliter of material. And this is what it looked like on glass. So I spent weeks experimenting with different ways of cleaning the glass and treating the glass to, play nice with the nanoparticles. But the results were pretty uninspiring. So amidst this whole technical quagmire, I felt like a failure. Looking back, though, I can see that I was learning a lot. I told you that the butterfly really changed my idea of how color and light work. Well, nanoparticles really changed my ideas of how color and light work. The flask on the right contains trillions of silver nanoparticles. It's almost impossible to conceive of how small these nanoparticles are. They're smaller than bacteria, than cells in your body. They're even smaller than wavelengths of light. This is key because when silver particles become smaller than the wavelengths themselves, you can control their color through the size, the shape, and the environment of these particles. So, for example, the spherical nanoparticles that you see here in this transmission electron micrograph, they look yellow to the naked eye. But triangular particles of the same substance look blue. Pretty weird. The phenomenon that produces this type of color is called surface plasmon resonance. Don't be turned off by the jargon. It's really poetic, actually. So imagine a cloud of electrons sloshing over the surface of a small piece of silver. Light waves come in and nudge these clouds of electrons off the surface, but they come back down. They get pushed off and then come back down. And that back and forth dance between light and the electrons we perceive as color. Since for a long time I couldn't figure out how to paint with these nanoparticles, I decided to just use what I had. And I had bottles and bottles and bottles of nanoparticle solutions. So I focused on making small, three-dimensional work with them. These pieces are inspired by the way water finds level, liquids find level, and by the meniscus that forms when a liquid is attracted to its container. Eventually, I had a series of technical breakthroughs that allowed me to paint a small amount of silver nanoparticles onto glass microscope slides. With time, I learned how to tweak the chemistry to get colors and effects I was interested in. And from there, I experimented with applying them in different ways that generated patterns and forms. And I decided that I didn't want to use the nanoparticles to create images or to represent something else. I really wanted to present the material and just to highlight its inherent qualities. This is one of the first tiny pieces I made this way. And though I wasn't thinking about it at the time, I realized how it's sort of an exaggerated structure of a layered oil painting like I was showing you. Over the next couple years, I continued working with this medium. I focused on scaling it up and working with it technically, working with it creatively. And during these years, a couple wonderful surprises happened. One was that, out of the blue, I got a phone call from a museum that was still being built. And it's called the Leonardo, actually, and it's a museum of art and science in Salt Lake City. And they asked me if they could commission an installation to be part of their permanent collection. I said yes. I was thrilled. These are two views of the first half of my installation. Each panel is 2 feet high, so I was able to get bigger, and contains some hundreds of quadrillions of nanoparticles. What color you see depends on what angle you view it from and where the light's coming from. This piece led to a second surprise, which was that a detail of the Leonardo piece was used on the cover of Nature. This image complements a paper by Stanford scientist Jen Dione and her student John Scholl. And it is in support of their article that talks about quantum effects that are observable in particularly small silver nanoparticles. Likewise, the Leonardo installation emphasizes the critical role that size plays in nanoscale color. To make the second half of the installation, I used a 19th century recipe for making mirrors. I did this because the recipes that the Victorians developed for making mirrors out of silver were actually foundational to much of contemporary nanoparticle synthesis. The way I make silver mirrors and the way I make silver nanoparticles are pretty similar, but the mirroring process creates larger chunks of silver. Because of the size difference, the two sets of panels look really different. Next to the nanoparticles, the Victorian mirror ones look kind of muted. But if you look closely, you can see that there are little whispers of blue and green in the panel on the left. And that suggests that there are traces of nanoscale formations present. After this project, I continued exploring what I could evoke by pairing this 19th century mirror-making technology with the contemporary nanotechnology. For me, pairing the two is a way to tie nanoscience with all of its futuristic space-age connotations to its deep history, and to acknowledge the diverse practitioners that have contributed to its development, from medieval stained glass window makers to 19th century mirror makers. Working with mirrors has given me another way to connect back to my training as a painter. So for many centuries, painting was called the mirror of nature. And the way I mimic morpho butterfly scales in this piece taps into that tradition. Also that I would labor in a lab for years to, create this nano paint to mimic butterfly scales sounds pretty sci-fi, not to mention maniacal. But I want to show that it's no different from the obsessive experimental inclinations of 15th century painters who went to extreme means to capture what they saw. Other mirrored works I make play with a different tradition of the mirror, one that we encounter in Snow White or Through the Looking Glass, that mirrors offer us access to other dimensions that are both familiar and strange. Along these lines, these mirrors present uncanny likenesses of creatures that don't exist. They're at once resolutely familiar and totally alien. Bodies and not bodies. In these and my most recent nanoparticle works, you can see that the body is working its way back into my work, as in the beginnings of bodies, the residue of bodies, and the primordial bodies that preceded ours. And recently, I've circled back to more traditional oil painting. I'm still making my own paints, but I'm also making my own optics that I use to view my subjects. This is a really crude lens I made out of gelatin. So I used this lens to look at silvery fish skins and then to paint them. Optical engineers call silvery fish skins multi-layer dielectric mirrors. And fish have evolved these multi-layer dielectric mirrors to mimic the surface of water. Engineers mimic these fish skins to improve optical devices like waveguides, fiber optics, and military camouflage. And me, I mimic the fish, which is an optical device, to make my paintings, which are also optical devices. And to what end? Honestly, I'm not sure. Both science and art ask us to enter into mystery and ambiguity. And when you put the two together, the ambiguity is only amplified, which makes for a murky future, but an exciting one. But I do have my current experiments to guide me. Lately, I've been experimenting with less exotic materials that exhibit viewing angle dependency, things like graphite and cowhide. I'm not sure what they want to be when they grow up, but that's in line with my journey so far. Chasing after shiny things I don't quite understand, and combining them in ways I never expected. Thank you so much.